All right, here we are. We're doing this a second attempt at a brief podcast illustrating the rich history of medieval cookery in the Castle Age. I mean, we're talking about the High Middle Ages, the Early Middle Ages, and also the Late Middle Ages. And we'll also talk a little bit about food that happened during the periods of the late Renaissance and colonial expansion, the periods that is famously known as the Baroque era. Uh, I don't. We just tried one of these podcasts, and Will lost connection, so I don't know where to begin. Last time we talked about uh, we began
Last
with talking
last thing
about
I heard was the
sugar
bread,
with bread. Oh, so you talked about bread. So I'll say
like
this.
the bread bowl thing.
Yeah, bread was
Yeah.
huge in the Middle Ages. People ate bread like we eat what? I don't know, like potatoes maybe or rice. I mean, it's a grain, but at the same time, they didn't just eat it like they would eat it without salt. They would eat it plain. They would eat it as like they had every echelon of society had bread. The rich is society, the nobility. They would have tend to have
Yeah.
bread that was had very processed grain, so the it was white bread essentially.
Wow.
And the poor people would have what we could think of as healthier bread now. They would have sort of like whole grain bread, whole, but it was only because the rich always wanted to have the white bread, wider grains, and even though those are considered less
Yeah.
nutritious. But you have to keep in mind that bread itself was viewed as sort of a confection as well as a staple. It had this very nebulous role of being sort of more than just what we think of as staple now. Like bread was a universal sort of substance, but at the same time,
Oh.
it wasn't just like it was associated with the body of Christ, but it was also tightly controlled in many places by guilds of artisans, of bakers, and we don't often connect the dots here, but brewers used the same ingredients that the bakers used. So brewers
Yep.
also had a similar level of secrecy and authority. And a lot of recipes, of course, were kept hidden, but bread's not a very hard thing to make, really. And peasants that could find a way to make bread would, but many times it was they would be penalized for doing that because it was so tightly controlled that making bread on your own it happened, of course, but it's just remarkable how many instances where it was actually illegal to make bread without
Huh.
having a qualification to do it. And the yeah, and the bakers, of course, could fix prices, and then they can make their own bread, and they were sort of privileged because they could make bread and then eat it themselves all they wanted. Kind of, it was sort of corrupt. Uh,
Yeah.
and the bread didn't necessarily have to be good quality either. It could have had like rocks and pebbles, stones, because they had to grind everything on by with a hand mill. It was a stone mill, or use ox carts or whatever, and they not ox carts, but oxen to pull the mill stone, and
Yeah.
that meant that little fragments of petroglyphs or what not petro. I'm joking. That's a joke. But like little tiny rocks and stuff would get in the bread sometimes. And that would fuck up people's teeth. So eventually, of course, they had higher quality mills that they would use, but but it wasn't always a given that they would have like the best possible grindstone. And the other thing is that the just we're talking about bread is that they had sweets that were made in abundance, but they were you always put used with honey, sweetened with honey, or with some with fruit. And it was only until the colonies were set up in the islands of the Caribbean and also in the Mediterranean and in Southeast Asia that sugar plantations could make sugar, as sort of a replacement for honey, and
Yeah.
it was a more robust uh, chemical, and actually had always been sort of seen as a chemical in the Middle Ages when it wasn't super available, because it was used by alchemists and apothecaries in certain instances to as sort of with a medicinal purpose, but it was very kind of it was seen as like kind of like a spice. It wasn't used as a whole, and not a particularly common one. The 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 kinds of breads that were made were really there's also incredible variety. Obviously, pasta is the best example now of the variety of sort of bread products that were made. But back then, they had sort of their own like they had dumplings all over the map that had they looked like ravioli maybe, or and they would have sweet fruits in them, a mushy paste of fruit or even candied fruit, and that was like a nice treat to have. And any bread that was edible was very like was favored. But sometimes they would, because of for economical reasons, the poorer people in society could not afford to eat bread that was like edible, and they would actually get dishes that had like meat with vegetables in them called meat pies. And these pies were not the pies that we think of, where you actually enjoy the crust. These pies had a very hard crust that would fuck up your teeth if you bit into it, and they would have to like sort of manually like wrench open the crust and get into the goods inside. It was basically a form of like packaging for the food or encasing, like takeout. It wasn't really a takeout box. It wasn't really food, but it was made of the same ingredients that the bread that the food
Yeah.
products are made out of. And keep in mind that they didn't just use wheat for their bread; they used rye and other sort of flours. Like they can make flours out of almonds. Even though almonds weren't super common, they were common enough because they could be sustainably imported. And also almonds, they made almond milk quite a bit, and they would use almond milk as sort of a milk substitute because milk had a problem where it would spoil, and so spoiled milk was unreliable. And so even though almonds were more expensive than milk, it was so much easier to deal with that they ended up putting it in all sorts of hot cross buns and pancakes and things like that. And actually, pancakes existed, and you won't be surprised to know that they weren't always sweet. A lot of the time, pancakes were actually had almost no flavor, or they were had vegetables mixed in with them, or they were savory, just salty. The Eventually people would it's not very hard to imagine a waffle iron, but the waffle iron that we associate with waffles was a Dutch invention that happened later on. And before that development, it was sort of a standardization of the waffling process. Waffles were traditionally made with custom irons that had all sorts of decorations on them and were very bespoke and individualized. And they had they could have later on, in later periods, they could have a flower or like a garland of some sort that would be pressed into the uh, the dough, the batter, right? And then that would make the waffle wouldn't have a grid. It would just have a sort of a somewhat unique design, ornamental design into it. And if you go to Europe now, you can even find places that still make waffles with that technique, and it's actually there's quite a sense of liberation from the prison gridlock of the gridiron waffle. The
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
That's funny.
it's kind of wild. And then, of course, meat in the Middle Ages wasn't like hard to come by, but it was expensive, and they didn't, and it wasn't economical to put meat into everything. So a lot of the time, the church would develop days where people had to fast in accordance with observing religious holidays and festivals. And also there was Lent, which is the most famous and I think believe longest fasting period in the Catholic liturgy. And they would basically say you can't have meat, but you can have some fish, or we can make some eggs that are fake, and they would literally hollow out the eggshell, take away the egg. I don't know what they did with them. Maybe they fed them. I don't know what they did with these eggs, but they got rid of the eggs entirely, and then they put a porridge in to the eggshell, and then they added some yellow dye to make it resemble an egg. and then
Wow.
people would eat that instead of an egg. It sounds bizarre. And another thing that they did, the Catholic Church did, which I think is a lot more charming, is that they would make pretzels. And they would say that they basically made pretzels like almost like a sacred kind of food, but they were associated with festivals because the priests and nuns and people would hand them out to like children, and they were usually subsidized a bit. Pretzels were kind of a cheaper food, and if they weren't subsidized, they were popular because they're not really an expensive pastry to make, and but they look cool. So pretzels had like almost like a celebrity status in medieval cookery, which is it's kind of not. It's you can see it a little bit, but you wouldn't necessarily intuit that the way pretzels are received now. The other thing is that beer, talking about beer and pretzels, right? Beer was very common, and it was a substitute for water
Hold up.
because
My connection's sort of cracking up again.
oh, okay, okay. One sec. Well, wait a sec. All right, can you hear me?
I'm gonna get in my house in a minute, and that should be better.
Okay, okay. So what I'll say is that bread bowls were obviously like a very early
Glad
adopted
you can hear me at least.
food. Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, bread bowls were a very early sort of invention, let's say, and unlike the
All
meat.
right, still on the call.
Okay,
I'm
unlike
going
the
inside.
unlike the meat pies, the bread bowls were okay. I'm running out of battery. Okay, now I have to charge my computer. Okay, interesting. He can't hear me, and my computer's dying. So I guess that we should have a pause, moment of silence. So as I was
No,
saying,
I can hear you now. I can hear you.
okay, okay. So as I was saying,
Can you
bread
hear me?
bowls. Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Bread bowls were sort of like the antidote to having these cheap pies that were made kind of for the poor as a fast food.
Great.
And the meat pies, I'll reiterate that the meat pies you could not eat the bread. It would fuck up your teeth usually, or like if you ate it, it'd be bad for your stomach because it's really solid and it's dehydrated. The the bread bowls though were is perfectly normal bread. So you would eat like a nice stew. Well, they have meat in it and veggies and all sorts of you could have legumes and like peas and you could have I imagine they had broccoli and carrots and things and I imagine that you could put root vegetables in it even. They didn't have potatoes, but you could put I think they had sweet potatoes that you might see, and then you could also have onions and so on and these bread and you could it was like Boston clam chowder. I mean, you could literally just it was like a perfect little hearty meal in one, and it was kind of neatly organized too. Now, as far as meat's concerned, the elite in medieval society enjoyed meat the most, and they had the highest quality meats. For instance, the kind of poultry they had access to was kind of unbelievable. Even nowadays, our access to poultry is like dwarfed by what the medieval lords could get and ladies. Right? They could get um, you
Would
know
you say our access is paltry?
poultry. Yeah, poultry. Yeah, we could get. I mean, we can. It's hard to get ducks, but they had ducks. It's hard to get swans. They had swans. Hard to get geese. They had geese. They had anything. I mean, I'm not sure if they had Cornish hen. They had. I'm sure they were eating pigeons. They probably weren't eating crows. That would have been very taboo. But anything that kind of they could get away with, they would eat. Now the poor people did not. They kind of had to rely on chickens and ducks because they just couldn't have like really nice, rich poultry all the time. And the same way that they couldn't really have beef as much. It's part of the reason why milk wasn't as accessible is because they just didn't really make it as often as you might think, especially in the far north. Or sorry, not the far north. The north would have more milk because the milk would spoil less often in the cold. In the southern parts, milk was harder to. I mean, they would have to process it into creams and cheeses in order to preserve it, and even in butter, and even that was kind of fraught with certain complications. Not perfect process by any means. Nothing about medieval processed food was perfect. Nothing about medieval cookery was perfect by today's standards. They didn't stamp expiration dates on the shell and when they shelled food. You would order something at a stall, and the food would either be undercooked, or it would be rotten, or it could or in some or it might be fine. And people didn't really have a lot of leeway about this. A lot of the meat that was used was low quality because it was expensive, and it was also recycled a lot because again it was expensive, and the cooks had to cook a lot of food, so sometimes they would just undercook food so that they can make more money, and they would cook something really quickly and not thoroughly, and they actually had a saying that I don't know if it was widespread, but there was a saying that emerged in the medieval age where, God brings the meat, but the devil brings the cooks. Because cooks sort of had a bad reputation. They were seen as shady at times, and they were seen as sort of corrupt at times. Because they really had a lot more access to great food than anyone else did. And that was sort of seen as a privilege. Uh, did I say anything about saffron?
No, you didn't.
Okay, so there were certain spices that, while today we have access to them, we don't see them a lot in like modern cookery, and we don't necessarily see them at restaurants. But back then, even though they were probably more expensive, you would see them a little bit more just because they were fetishized so much. And one of those was saffron. You could also say similar things about cinnamon. They liked cinnamon in the Middle Ages. They didn't have a lot of it, but they liked it. They also liked almonds. I think I touched on this. They didn't have a ton of it, but they liked it. And obviously, they had no tomatoes or chocolate or vanilla or potatoes or anything that we really take that stuff for granted. But like vanilla is interesting in a way as a tangent because vanilla was a New World product and part of the Columbian
I didn't know
Exchange.
that.
But vanilla is actually really rare now, and the prices are really high because the countries it's developed in, I think, namely, most famously is Madagascar. They have a lot of like conflict over vanilla farms because it's such a cash crop that
Wow.
the vanilla farms are being sort of like mismanaged, and basically the price is like a price shock in vanilla right now. So nowadays you have to get artificial vanilla if you really want to make a lot of foods with vanilla flavor in it, and they use a compound called vanillin
Huh.
for that, which is also in the vanilla bean. But in the Middle Ages they didn't have anything like vanilla at all. They didn't, and or chocolate or there's a lot of things that
Wow.
we could go on about, but bananas, avocados, tobacco, you know. But
Wow.
yeah, they had in the Middle Ages they relied on a variety of grains, which is actually what made them, which was actually a very good thing for their diet. It's something we sorely lack. And they had, flax, which was also used to make linen, and they had oats, and they had they had barley for that's not a grain, but that was something that they used a lot for flavor. And another vegetable, a lot of their vegetables were used in a variety of ways. And the most obvious sort of example of this is the stews that they would make, where they would put any kind of vegetable into these stews. Like it was sort of a catch-all, right? You could put any kind of food in the stew, and stews were incredibly, I won't say popular, but they were widespread, and were kind of one. They were one of the few things that peasants would cook that they could kind of do without relying on the ovens of the people of the bakers and stuff, and the stall people cooks who could cook higher quality foods. The stew was something that was a little bit more accessible to the lowest in the peasant class. The Yeah, and I mean, I don't know what more to say. There's always more to learn about this topic. I mean, they had, um, they would have pigs that they would roast whole, but then they would actually candy the outside of the pig and make the pig sweet. The sweet meat was like something that you all don't get a lot anymore, but it was kind of a common thing is that to mix in to sweeten meat with honey, was kind of a common thing back then because maybe they just didn't have that many options in food, so they just kind of got a little creative with it. I also like to think that they just genuinely enjoyed it, and they sort of learned. It was a learned, it was a what's like what does they say the palate? It's what
Acquired
an
taste.
acquired taste, yeah, for the palate. Yeah, but it's actually it's its own world, man. Medieval cookery. It's not something that really should be taken that lightly. And if we were eating more like them, we'd probably be a lot healthier as a country.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, just a lot less sugar for one thing.
Yeah, a lot less sugar. Yeah, I mean, again, sugar was like a chemical to them. It was like regarded a little bit with suspicion. I want to say, and then but then it became so accessible that they had to put in everything. It was a drug. It went from being a chemical to a drug, and then now we think of it as food, but it wasn't always so.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, that's great. I mean, that's a lot, really. I mean, just thinking of certain things like that, sometimes they weren't even allowed to cook. That's like so interesting, such an interesting like insight into their world. Uh, I gotta I gotta go now though.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We were only supposed to do this for half an hour, and we had to do it twice. So
Yeah,
we actually did more than half an hour. And I know that you're a
yeah.
busy man, so I'll
Well,
let you
thank
go.
you. Well, hey, I got more than my money's worth, so that there's that.
Yeah, well, yeah, you paid no money, so I guess that it's infinite, right?
Yeah, exactly. An infinite percentage
Oh,
profit,
improvement.
which
Yeah.
pretty
All right,
damn
man.
good.
All right, let me start recording. Again, I hope you guys like this little podcast, and there's more to come. There's a lot to talk about in this fucking world. There's a lot to talk. And it's very easy to read. And then
Nice.
it's almost easier to just talk about what you read than it is to read. So.
Yeah, definitely.